to the ashes of the Imperium.
Hello and welcome to Ashes of the Imperium. My name is Dan, and today I'm joined by a very special guest, Chris Tester, otherwise known as @ChrisNaturallyRP. Chris is a voice actor with whom you may already be familiar with due to his fantastic work on Reels or TikToks, bringing characters of the 31st and 41st Millennium to life. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here, albeit digitally. Yeah.
Yes, it's always funny to have someone come onto the show who you've listened to a lot before, and you're like, oh, that's the voice, that's them, it's really them.
Hello, it's the voice in your head and on your phone and all of those kind of things.
Oh my god, if the voices in my head were voiced by you, Chris, that's phenomenal.
All of them, for just a small monthly fee.
Join now on Patreon.
We voice actors do have to diversify our income in the face of AI. So yeah, sure.
Anything yes, AI. Well, I'll add that to the question set later.
Okay, yeah, sure.
But I suppose in your own words, tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I am a actor and voice actor or voiceover, but I graduated from drama school in 2008 and did a lot of stage work, almost exclusively stage work, really. And then off the back of that, I've always been kind of like a gamer. Had been interested in the Warhammer kind of stuff when growing up, as is, the very well-established route. And then you go and do other things for a bit. You get distracted by other kind of things. And acting had always been my kind of like passion. And then really only since about 2017 got back into voiceover work, which is always something that I kind of like knocked on the door of, but hadn't really had much success. I'd quite notoriously, written to the same like 20 big voiceover agents in the UK for I think about 8 years consecutively, and like just got absolutely no interest whatsoever. But a big game changer for me was when I realized that you could actually set up your recording a recording space from home, and you can actually reach out to people directly that way. And so that gave me something else to hyperfixate on. But the other thing that it did was it ended up giving me a lot more autonomy. So voice acting became my main focus, certainly my main kind of source of income. And then in 2020, I was kind of touring a theatre show, which I was producing and acting in when, the world changed
2020, the famously good year for theatres.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's famously good. And kind of off of the back of that and the almost absolute decimation of the subsidized theatre industry in this country, haven't been back on stage since. So having normally been, doing 2, 3, 4 stage shows a year on average, I was denied that, and therefore had to find something else, both to pay the bills, and also kind of construct my sense of self around. And so that's where the voice acting kind of really came in, which then led to the Warhammer stuff again, really.
Awesome. And how did that sort of voice acting into Warhammer transition occur?
Sure. So money, first and foremost, that's how I transitioned in. I randomly got a audition, I think probably back in 2017 for Total War 2. And that was with the developer Creative Assembly, who obviously developed all of the Total War kind of franchise. And I'd always kind of like kept tabs on the Warhammer world a little bit more. The kind of 40k side of things was my real kind of like passion, but it was always kind of like cool to see, especially the video game side of things and how franchises were being used and in kind of like fun ways. So yeah, I auditioned and was successful, thankfully, for the role of Lockyer Fellhart, so kind of vampire pirate, which is very much my kind of USP.
The Kraken Lord himself.
The Kraken Lord himself, yeah. I mean, looks ridiculously kind of like cool.
He's very metal, isn't he?
He is. He's incredibly metal, and I loved him for that. Not necessarily the most humorous of people, but that's fine. Has a fantastic taste in kind of purple robes and that kind of thing.
It's certainly his color for sure.
Yeah, it's certainly his color. That and the gleaming red, and then the gold mask. So I had a ball with that. It kind of, even though the vast majority of that is battle cries and taunts and occasionally negotiations and that kind of stuff, it did kind of like reacquaint me with how rich these worlds are, and kind of like it did kind of like spark an element of nostalgia in me. And so I started more kind of proactively. I literally just went onto the Games Workshop website for the first time for the first time when I was playing it originally. I'm sure they didn't have a website, and started to discover what was going on. I suddenly realized that the Black Library existed and that there was this huge, expanse of, written work going out. I'd been completely oblivious to the expansion of the lore. So I started, reading around there, starting with the Eisenhorn trilogy, the kind of go-to entry level. What the hell is all of this about? But it's not so overwhelming type of thing. And from there, kind of like that started to really reignite a passion for it. And then, had the opportunity to be in some more video games and other projects related with the franchise. And then also, working that ultimately led with working with the Black Library on 2 anthologies now set in the 40K universe, which I've had the honor and the pleasure of being able to kind of like work on. And so, yeah, I mean, it's although obviously, especially with the Horus Heresy, it's all now kind of like come to the close. Whereas I feel as if I'm only about 10 books in, really, and then everything else is kind of scattershot because I've obviously been picking up bits and pieces otherwise. But I feel as if I'm still really in the early stages of discovering what everybody else knows only too well about.
Have you managed to avoid any major spoilers?
No, not really. I kind of know pretty much everything.
You know that Horus is a baddie, right? You've got that far.
Yeah, I know that things don't necessarily go that well. I think this is both the blessing and the curse of certainly how I create content, and people kind of like suggest different kind of parts of the lore for me to take a look at, shall we say, is that it can go of one of two ways. Either I can try and suspend my disbelief and make some terrible errors, or you do some basic rudimentary research. And also when I was hired in for the Black Library for a lot of those anthologies, it was very much focusing on the origin stories of the various estranged sons of your god emperor. So again, then having as much of an understanding as quickly as possible. Black Library do a fantastic job in being able to condense down the information. There are some narrators who are entrenched in the lore and live and breathe it and love it. There are some people who have a working knowledge of it because it's their job. And I think that's part of the balance that a producer like the Black Library has to be kind of like careful with. It's like, you can't just hire people who are fans of the material. They also have to, be able to come up with all of the different character voices and sustain that level of narration and, have a working knowledge of how they all kind of work kind of differently and dramatically, which is kind of like a fascinating aspect to it as well. So I feel like I've got quite a healthy balance, which is that I am a huge fan of the lore that I have experienced thus far. And, I find it really, really interesting and I proactively want to learn more, but I'm not so entrenched in it that I think it can only be done one way, or that there is a definitive interpretation of X, Y, or Z kind of character. I think part of the the nature of something like the Black Library is that Jonathan Keeble's take on X, Y, or Z character is always going to be subtly different from Gareth Armstrong's or Toby Longworth's or Richard Reed's or whoever's, and I think that's part of where the kind of the fun element kind of comes in as well.
Absolutely. And I think in the 41st millennium, especially, or insert 31st era as well, but in the 41st millennium, there's always that kind of catch-all of everything you hear is part propaganda, part history rewritten by the victors, part handed down in word of mouth and that kind of thing. And so there's lots of degradation of the truth. And so I know that's obviously a kind of an easy catch-all for retcons or arguably mistakes or different views. So when you play a computer game and a character does one thing, and then you listen to a Black Library book, and then you pick up an old codex and then a new codex, and there's slight variations in things, there is that catch-all of it's the 41st millennium. There is no like secure database.
Yeah, certainly from a cynical point of view, you can go like, that's a very shrewd business model. Well done, congratulations. But I think also kind of making the form fit the message, I think is a masterstroke. I think it's incredibly clever and intentional in that respect, because you cannot, if there was a undisputable canon, canon interpretations, that kind of stuff, it's an impossible thing to execute at that scale. I mean, it literally, you can't have that consistency, and yet at the same time, thematically, it's about emotionally inconsistent characters fundamentally at its base, or things that you cannot form. And having the god, the emperor of mankind at the center of that narrative of, is he even a body, does he even exist, the voices in your head, all of those kind of things at the same time, what is it? And I think that the fascinating thing is that there are those elements to each one of the kind of characters. I think also just the fact that it therefore allows artists, it allows writers to come in and do their best work without freedom, without that feeling of like, oh shit, I'm going, I have to fit. I have to fit the form that someone else has made. I know at the same time, Dan Abnett's putting together The End and the Death has had to kind of like correspond with in depth with 20, 30 other writers, probably, as well as Games Workshop directly, to make sure that he is observing all of the right things and closing off all of the right arcs and all of those kind of things. So there's a tension there, but I think that's something from a performer perspective is really exciting, because you get a feeling that you can put a stamp on something. You can still honor however much you think Guilliman is a prick, or is amazing and incredibly principled, or anything like that. But you've still got an element of interpretation and playfulness with that, which is the main thing.
And just out of interest, where do you sit on that scale, the Primarch of the Ultramarine scale?
My first kind of army that I played were Ultramarines, so I feel slightly balanced. I think he has his fallible moments, shall we say?
Yes, as all good heroes do.
Yes, indeed. He's a bit of an idiot sometimes, I'll be honest. But bless him.
I still maintain my favorite Gilliman moment was him, turning up after his stasis, and everyone being like, "Hey, listen, when you wrote the codex, we've slavishly adhered to it like dogma, just like you wanted." And he's like, "Say what? You've done what?" And they're like, "Yeah, we've been doing this. No one's allowed to do this or that." And he's like, "No, pirate code kind of guidelines vibe, lads. What are you doing?"
I knew I should have had a couple of footnotes or something just to kind of clarify and explain everything. Yeah. It's true. I mean, I think it's such a difficult. He's such a difficult character in the same way, because a lot of the bad boys do bad boy stuff, and that's generally a lot more interesting and a lot more cool. They can be let off the leash in a completely different way, but he serves a great purpose, and he's an amazing foil to a lot of those kind of like scenarios. And then it's that whole testing of the faith thing, and I think that's why you have to have a character like him in the universe as well, and playing that role.
Yeah, and especially as spoilers, Sanguinius being dead.
Spoilers.
I think a lot of the Primarchs. I think I remember him being referred to. He was the best of us amongst the Primarchs, and he embodied a purity of spirit and something that the Imperium is no longer.
Yeah.
And I think Gilliman isn't that. He isn't that kind of pure idol almost. Because he's a ruthless tactician. He's very ambitious, and whilst he is, in inverted commas, a goodie, he isn't what Sanguinius was. And so with that kind of grey area comes a bit of play. And as you say, like the baddies are the best characters. Villains make the best characters.
But they're all. I mean, the good guys are also the fascists. So
well, yes, we yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something that Games Workshop struggles with, because it's trying to sell this kind of, here are the goodies, they're in bright blue, but they are effectively the foot soldiers for a totalitarian fascist regime, which is bad. And coming from the kind of the punk roots of the 80s original Warhammer into the modern world, the story has remained similar, but I suppose society has also changed and hasn't necessarily always taken the satirical nature of Warhammer on board. But equally, Games Workshop don't sell the satirical nature on board. They sell goodies versus baddies, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people out there who just don't get it, and that can be disturbing. That can be worrying, and that's certainly in terms of like, there are people that have followed me on social media whose worldviews I will explicitly say I do not agree with in any way, shape, or form, and they'll be fans of something like 40k, and I'll immediately know, like, yeah, you're not getting any of the irony in this
Yeah.
interpretation. Which is why, I mean, partly I only have a very passing knowledge about fandoms, how tribal people can be, and how protective people can be about these certain things, because there are other things in their lives that they can't control, and therefore they use something else to hyperfixate on as a result, to feel as if they've got that level of control. Yeah, I'm certainly aware of that being at play, and I try not to engage with that because, first and foremost, I don't know enough about these things to pretend that I do, but also I have a finite amount of time and energy. So I embrace what I can and I serve what I can. And plus, there's always that tension of like, yes, I have worked for Games Workshop, and I have worked for companies that Games Workshop have licensed their various franchises to. So I have to play. On the one hand, I need to be open and creative and forge relationships with people at the same time, but I also need to be hireable. And going all in, too extremely on one particular thing and creating a lot of additional kind of friction or getting in massive like online arguments about stuff and things like that isn't going to serve me very well
No,
in
no,
terms of my actual
absolutely.
kind of career. So it's that balance. It's continually that balance of how much do you say, what do you stand for, etc., etc., etc. So yeah, there's a tension there by all
No,
means.
I'm with you. And another use of the word balance there, which I think you've used before in terms of being into the law and also being, I suppose, a creative, an actor, and being and doing things your own way.
Yeah.
I've noticed there in your kind of your CV for Warhammer Total War, the balance is slightly one way. You've got Lockhill Felhart. You played a bunch of Nurgle characters in Warhammer 3, and some orcs as well. You're
Yeah.
very, very much on the kind of the baddie side. Is that something you find yourself drawn to?
I mean, the cliche for a reason is that they tend to be the better written characters, the more interesting kind of like characters, probably. But also, it's a lot to do with how I sound. I mean, not necessarily like an orc. I get it, but my whole career is in part defined by my voice, how it sounds, and the associations that come with it. And this is most explicit in more obvious voiceover stuff like commercials and corporate work, where people will have immediate affiliations, immediate responses to hearing someone with a kind of like this neutral Southern British English kind of accent of a certain kind of middle class white kind of like trope. It means that I'm good for certain markets and less good for other kind of like markets. And although when you go more into the character stuff, obviously you have to have a degree of flexibility and be able to change your instrument and all of those kind of things. Certainly with the orcs, and to a degree with Nurgle as well, when your face is decomposing and all of this kind of thing. And at the same time, you've got that slight theatrical bent, which Nurgle and his clan tend to have the same thing. But it does mean that you're probably considered for certain roles more than others. But there's a relish and a playfulness that I think a lot of the villain characters tend to have, or an appreciation of their own theatricality. I think that's definitely in Locke here. That's definitely in Nurgle to a degree, just by the phrasing of what he says. And then I think in something like the 40k universe as well, you have someone like Fulgrim. Never use three words when you could use three sentences.
Excess in all things,
Yeah,
absolutely.
excess in all things, or even in a very different way, someone like Lorgar being able to obfuscate and explain at the same time.
Lorgar's the ultimate politician.
Yeah,
Lorgar is absolutely that bloke that you can't pin down for an answer, isn't he?
it's amazing. I mean, I think that my real the book that kind of like properly got me back in to it was Betrayer. And
Oh,
I think
phenomenal
that,
book.
yeah,
Such a book.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely amazing. And I think that's probably some of Lorgar's greatest hits in many kind of like ways. A lot of the speeches that he comes up and the kind of like the various different arguments and faces off that he has there as well. But yeah, I mean, that kind of capacity to be able to almost kind of argue yourself into and out of the same situation in the same encounter, I think is absolutely amazing. So yeah, the most interesting thing as an actor to play off is an obstacle. If you've got something to hit against, then it feels as if you've got a real kind of like challenge, and quite a lot of, especially as we've already established in the 40k kind of universe, there are no shining knights, really. Quite a lot of them have internal obstacles. Some would call them just daddy issues, but internal obstacles to which you can kind of like play, and that always tends to make it a lot more fun. But even when I was playing Henrik's in Rogue Trader 40k, and he's ostensibly as a player companion, playing very much to the Inquisitor straight down the line, hail the God Emperor type of thing. But then it's kind of like bound up in what his belief system is, and how much can you make him actually challenge that. That's where the fun and interesting stuff kind of gets in, where you can find those kind of like rhythm changes and delve a little bit deeper into the psychology of the character as well. So yeah, I mean, I think if you're working in the Warhammer universe, you're going to be more favoring the villains kind of by default, because few of them come out well. Sanguinius being the shining example of otherwise, and his whole "even if you run away, it's absolutely fine with me" type of like mindset. But for the rest of them, they're all pretty damaged in one way or another.
And so, talking of villains, just touching a point you said earlier, and also about I suppose, your brand.
Love a brand.
Love a brand. I suppose the Southern British RP middle class accent. I suppose like quite a vanilla accent, if you will, but also one that I think is associated, as you say, with different things. If you're, I think you've done a commercial for BMW before. Yes, hello, I'm talking to you about a car. It's very reliable. You can trust me. But also, we're touching on villains. It's weird that in a commercial sense, the accent is associated with trust and reputation, but in a creative sense, it's often one that's the go-to for villains. And I'm just thinking Jeremy Irons playing Scar, like anything James Mason in North by Northwest, things like that. Even back into the those kind of
anything
golden
with
days.
Alan Rickman in.
What absolute hero.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think the British accent is so, I suppose, like relatable or the go-to for villains?
It's the voice of colonialism, essentially, in a lot of ways, and I think that is a big issue. And I think there's also from a UK perspective, it's because everything that we do is innately wrapped up in class, in terms of class. And whilst I came from a generation where still at drama school, everybody was expected to learn how to speak RP first. You would have people training. There were 32 of us in my year group at drama school in London. And that was people from around the world, from Mexico, from America, from South Africa. And the one accent that everybody was trained to attempt to master anyway was RP. Because still, even at that sense, it was kind of like, you need to learn this because this is the voice that we do Shakespeare and classical acting in this country to do. And from that point onwards, then you can maybe be deigned to utilize your own native accent if that becomes useful to you. But this is kind of like, it's a given that you need to work in that. Now, that has radically changed, and we're now going massively the other kind of like way. And that it can only be an incredibly helpful and healthy kind of step for people to be able to embrace where they actually kind of like come from and who they represent. And in terms of attempting at least to see, a greater diversity of faces on our TV screens and the voices that we hear. For me, as an awareness of all of these kind of things, I mean, you say, for example, with the BMW thing, and it's true to a degree that, there's a certain amount of trust that comes with my voice because of authority. That's partly because of the pitch of my voice, but it's to do with like that level of clarity and professionalism is very much kind of ensued and endowed, because figures of seniority generally do tend to speak more in that particular tone because they come from that particular kind of class, I would say, still in the business world anyway. So with something like BMW, it's not a family car. overtly that you're going for. And also you have to have a certain level of money to be able to afford one. So we're not going full on kind of like luxury, but there's an awareness there, I would say. Whereas maybe 10, 15 years ago, I might sell you banking services and that kind of thing. Quite often it's somebody with a much warmer accent. So maybe, a Dublin accent or a Scottish accent. Quite often, if you still manage to get through to a real person at a call center to talk stuff with your bank, they're more likely to connect you with someone who has a softer, more warmer accent, so that you're less likely to be irate as a result of having a conversation with them. Whereas my voice could be interpreted as more formal, professional, detached.
And possibly on the other side of that coin, elitist and condescending.
Yeah, elitist and condescending, definitely. So that there's an awareness and attention within that. Like my voiceover brand is Naturally RP, so I have obviously leaned into it. That was almost exclusively just to do with the fact that before I started voiceover stuff, I already had a website, which is my name, christophertester.co.uk, and I wanted to separate it so that I had a clear voiceover website and a acting website, and maybe the two are linked, and they are linked now, but they serve separate purposes and I didn't want them confused. And so I thought, how do I differentiate it? Well, I could call it christophertestervo.co.uk, or just as to be different, just to stick out in terms of a branding perspective, to be a little bit more memorable than just another person kind of posing behind a microphone looking vaguely self-aware. Maybe I could do something a bit more interesting to it. And also because, yeah, I can do some accents, but I'm not a transformational kind of like chameleon in terms of the accents that I can do, and never pretend to do that. 95% of the work that I do is in calls on my authentic voice, my real accent, that kind of stuff. I embrace that to the extent where I wear a suit and I have a teacup on my voiceover website, and that's very much leaning into that archetypal kind of like British voice and the corporate work. That was the first kind of like work that I got regularly, because my first priority was, can I actually make this a viable career for myself? And so that was a way of making me be memorable to the voiceover clients that I was getting. So I certainly appreciate that for a lot of people who maybe only know me for the Warhammer stuff, if they do come across my voice acting website, they might be somewhat confused by the suit and the teacup, but hopefully there's an appreciation that it's kind of like it's not taking itself too seriously. I'm not saying that all corporate and business kind of relations need to be conducted in suits with teacups at hand or any of that kind of stuff. And hopefully it hasn't pigeonholed me in a different kind of way, but it's just a way of me making myself that I'm memorable, I suppose, to people who might give me work, if that makes sense.
No, that makes absolute sense. In terms of someone looking to get into voice acting, because I know there's a few projects out there of people who write Warhammer short fiction and sort of community source voice actors. Is there any recommendations you'd make?
I mean, for those people wanting to get started and getting into it, I mean, I'd say practice is the kind of the main thing. There are a lot of voice actors just starting out who are open to collaborating, and I did myself. I worked on a piece with Cold Open Stories on one of their kind of like
that's who I'm thinking of. Cold Open Stories.
Yeah, exactly, which was amazing. Fantastic to work with, because they also kind of produce it to such a high standard. Quite often and they push things. They even added kind of like effects and music to the project that I worked on. And I think it's important to continue to engage with those kind of people and learn by doing, essentially. I mean, for all of the people that do want to get involved in voice acting, the number one priority is, can you act? That means different things to different people, and it will depend on the kind of voiceover work that you want to do. But yeah, kind of acting is kind of key, because if it is just to do with like, can you do a good Jonathan Keeble, or can you do a good voice or voices? I mean, that's great to a degree, but there are lots of people who already can do that. It's mainly about making those characters kind of like come alive and knowing how to do that quickly and instinctively. And then it's to do with kind of relationship building. And, social media has been a new way for me to kind of like find new opportunities and leverage them. But what once you feel relatively confident in your acting chops to a degree, then it's about, reaching out to as many people as possible and just saying, hi, I exist, I'm here, I would love to be a resource to you at some point in the future, just so you know. And that's essentially the job.
Yeah, that makes sense. And how do you find voice acting for computer games versus, I suppose, more traditional roles such as audiobooks or even stage work? How do you find the differences?
It very much depends on the game, I suppose. I think it's easy to kind of like think that the video games are the sexy stuff because so many of us play them, and a lot of them are getting budgets that rival or even surpass films. Some are incredibly cinematic, and so you want to be part of that. And so always looking for those opportunities is great. And so knowing what kind of games that you actually want to do, I think is kind of like key. I don't do vast quantities of games, partly because of my skill set and partly because of my interests. So yeah, I've done lots of kind of shouting on a battlefield, and the Total War games were great fun for that. But they were great fun for that also because you had those bargaining sections and the cinematic sections, and there was actually quite a lot of dialogue to be able to get your teeth into, sometimes literally. Whereas if it's just a question of shouting grenade for 2-3 hours or being set on fire for 2 or 3 hours, I'm less fussed. I'm less fussed about those kind of games. It's more the overarching kind of experience. But I would say like you are more likely to have to kind of like transform your voice a little bit more in video games than you would even if you're transforming as characters in an audiobook. There's a bit more of a suspension of disbelief in audiobooks, whereas with video games, you kind of have to go there if you are playing a creature. And I think that's important. And similarly, I think if you are having to do deaths or explosions and all of this kind of stuff, it's very much for realsies with the video games, depending on the genre, a lot more. So those cries of those death shrieks or whatever, quite often they want you to hear. A voice director wants to hear your voice break rather than kind of faking it to a degree. So having that kind of like self-conscious element about how to look after your voice to make sure that you don't damage anything permanently. And I always make sure to kind of like schedule gaming voice sessions towards the end of the day whenever possible, so that I don't have anything to record immediately afterwards, because your voice can sometimes have to kind of like drop. But there are some really fantastic kind of like long form narrative experiences that you can be part of. So it's a rich world out there.
And talking of worlds, you mentioned that you've played Total War a little bit. What world is or I suppose era, perhaps better to say, is your favorite Total War? Medieval, Rome, Shogun, or even Warhammer?
Yeah, well, all of the ones that I'm in. No, I mean, for me,
Specifically 2 and 3, and only playing as the legendary Lord Lockyer Felhart.
yeah. That would be the safe bet. I actually have the very first time I played Total War was the Rome, and I think I probably have the strongest affection for that. And the was it the Troy DLC as well? I very much appreciated that. It scratched my brain in a terms of like, it's a bit like playing Gladiator essentially, and I could pretend to be the next Nero. So yes, that was probably my favorite one.
Yeah, I think Medieval 2 for me.
Okay,
Being a student of history with a focus on the medieval period, that for me that was like
very nice,
peak
very nice.
Total War, but also coincided with a period of my childhood that I had lots of spare time to play it in as well.
Awesome, yeah.
Do you know what? I've not actually played a huge amount of Warhammer Total War, which is weird because I absolutely love Warhammer and I absolutely love Total War. But it's one of those things where there's so much, it's so time consuming that I've just put it off because I'm like, I can't just dip into it and dip out of it.
I've played a couple of sessions, but like each time it ended in horrible, overwhelming kind of defeat. And there is that degree where you really need to know what you're doing. You either find a way of whacking the difficulty right the way down, at which point it doesn't become a challenge anymore, and then literally what
And
is
then
the
it's just a
point?
time sink, and you're just kind of clicking
Yeah.
moving your finger around the
And
map.
then it's like, so what are you doing? So the tension then is kind of like, well, do I if I'm going to learn all of these mechanics and everything, then that's a time sink in a different kind of like way. And to
Mm.
be honest, that's the tension that I find in a lot of video games now. It's like I used to be a massive gamer, but I feel as if I've kind of like peaked in my gaming. In that now I there are very few things where it's like I can either put the difficulty down to normal and this is a cakewalk and I feel as if that I'm cheating myself, or I put it up that level and it's like, okay, I actually need to put 40 or 50 hours into this game before I get good at it, and I'm like, I don't have 40 or 50 hours that I can actually justify right now to be able to do that. And so yeah, there's always a bit of a kind of like a tension there for sure. But I've admired the mechanics of the game from like watching a lot of playthroughs, because as a voice actor, that's quite often what you're doing. As soon as quite often you don't know what franchise it is that you're actually acting for. So you have to make kind of educated guesses or try and look up as much information as possible. And as a result, that means that you spend a lot of time on YouTube, literally going through playthroughs, kind of going, what's the register of this kind of game? What's kind of, how realistic is the voice acting? How heightened are the characters? What kind of scenarios do they tend to be in?
Hmm.
Because then that will inform your choices so that you can be more malleable and directable and get to know the language of the game more instinctively.
And especially coming in for Total War 2, you could use
Mm.
Total War 1 as a, Warhammer Total War 1 as a reference point. How
Yeah.
over the top and campy are the bad guys?
No, exactly. I exactly. They actually sent us like YouTube links of playthroughs saying these are the cinematics and these are the style and this is how big it is, really. And it's quite big.
It is, it certainly is.
Yeah, that kind of stuff. So it's like, when in doubt, more is more with those kind of things. And then there are the degrees of nuance, but 9 times out of 10, with video game stuff, still, although there might be there's more cinematic storytelling kind of post The Last of Us in a lot of ways, but quite often in terms of choices, you go big first and then they can scale you back. Quite often, voice directors, the difficult part is when you tell someone to go for it and that, they're barely pushing and you've got to kind of actively extract more out of them. So as a voice actor, it's just being unashamed in kind of like going big and bold with your choices as quickly as possible, because then they've got something to respond to, I think.
That makes sense. And in terms of Warhammer in general, it's all the way up to 11 almost all the time, isn't it? So
Yeah.
you can fairly
Well,
safely.
I mean, certainly in the games it is, and in a lot of the books it is as well. But I mean, to be honest, that's why I find like recording stuff for social media quite nice to be different, because I think there's a lot of the writing that, in actual fact, is not best served from always being up to 11. So I think being able to play with that tone a little bit more, I think you have more license to when you're just doing a little skit for the sake of itself on social media, as
Hmm.
opposed to being responsible for the heavy lifting of, there's a 14 hours of this story that need telling and I need to honor all of the beats, or I need to be consistent in the world. I'm very clear in terms of like when I do record like a Warhammer 40k speech or anything, I often don't know the material that well, and I try to embrace that as maybe it'll put a different take on something than what people are expecting. And I think that's sometimes quite a good thing, because then maybe people reassess a little bit in terms of what their conception of the character can be. And I think, going back to what we were saying at the beginning, in terms of like these characters that have multiple kind of like levels, and it's not exactly an unreliable narrator, but they're seen through different kind of perspectives depending on who's telling the story at what time and all of those kind of things. So that kind of approach tends to lean into that kind of interpretation, I think.
And you've done some fairly punchy, emotive scenes. I think
Mm.
one that comes to mind. is at the end of Devastation of Baal when Gilliman,
Yeah.
circling back to Bobby G again, but Gilliman appears to Dante.
Yeah.
And that is having listened to that audiobook myself, seeing you do it's done in a very different way to how it was done in the audiobook, but it's just as good. It's just a different type of good.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's partly to do with the acting, and I think that's partly to do with in terms of the actor, the actor involved. People will have different kind of like choices, but also it's different. Like when I have to do when I'm making a little video where you can see me, so you kind of know because of a lighting change or whatever who's supposed to be speaking, so you don't have to make that great a differentiation in the voices. And I think because I've only been doing audiobooks for a year, my thing at the moment right now is, on the one hand, you want to be transformative enough so that people know who it is that they're talking to, and making sure that not every single character has your rhythm and your way of saying things, even if you are doing a different accent. But at the same time, so that the accent or vocal choice doesn't take over the character entirely to the point where psychological realism is kind of like out the door as a result, or it confines certain things. So all I feel is that, I probably place less emphasis in my videos on vocal transformation or I can use effects, which in an audiobook context, you just can't quite often, because that requires time and money and continuity to be able to do that all the way through a book. So that I can focus more on just doing justice to the writing and the thoughts behind the writing, I suppose, is my kind of thing. So if that frees it up and it gives someone a different perspective on on a scene, or slightly different kind of like vibe, then great. Then I feel as if I've done my job. But I'm just, I'm using it all as practice, essentially, to just kind of go, here's a completely different scenario. I don't 100% understand what's going on at all. So what can I deduce from the text? What can I deduce from the subtle kind of hints of how this person seems to be speaking and addressing this other kind of like person? And then go with your instincts. Because 9 times out of 10, like with video games, for example, you hardly ever get the script in advance, or you almost never get the script in advance. When I was doing Rogue Trader, I'm a companion character. You can romance me. I didn't discover that until I was reading the lines on a spreadsheet, and there was a kind of a seduction option, and I was like, oh. So this is a thing, and they were like, "Oh yeah, yeah."
Do you remember any of your seduction lines, Chris?
No, I mean he's very awkward. I mean, to be honest, it's about can I put the pen on the table slightly closer to your pen? It's that kind of level.
Goodness
of candid
gracious,
humor.
this is. I'll have to beep that out, mate.
Hot stuff.
Family friendly podcast. This.
Yeah, but it's kind of like, I didn't realize I've been recording for 5 hours before I found that out, and you're like, what?
And it's all death to the Xenos, exterminatus, fire and brimstone here and there, and then suddenly
that's when you just got to put faith in the writers and the directors, that they know their process, they know that they're getting what they want from you, so they'll say if they're not getting what they want from you. But I was a bit kind of like, I would have quite maybe liked to have known before, but it's just, and the nature of the deal is they don't have the time to flesh out all of these things. So you, as an actor, have to just kind of like pick up these cues as quickly as possible. And yeah, that goes for the audiobooks as well, because the practicalities of doing an audiobook is that you're paid per finished hour. The more times you read the book to prepare for it, essentially, the less money you're being paid per hour to do it, if that makes sense. You're spending more time doing it. So on the one hand, you want to do a good job, but you want to do a good job without rereading each story 50 times, because then
it's your own time you're burning. You're not necessarily in the studio, but it's your own time, which is, as a self-employed voiceover artist, that's your money-making time.
Yeah, exactly. And with audiobooks especially, it's kind of like there's a lot more kind of time. The time to money ratio is much higher in almost pretty much any other genre of voiceover work. Audiobooks rates, especially in the UK, are kind of one of the lowest sources of money. So you need to either get really good at it very, very quickly, and slash or be incredibly passionate about the work that you're kind of like doing. And so, yeah, that's a bit of a balancing act for sure.
And I suppose on previous work, is there a character that's been your favorite or particularly memorable in the past?
I mean, from the 40K world, I not sure really.
Well, let's go Warhammer Worlds in general.
I mean, Warhammer in general. I mean, I mean, to be honest, I would say still kind of like Lorgar is kind of like close to me ever since. But I think because he was my kind of like, as I was saying, my gateway back in
Mm.
to the lore, and there was that level of kind of real kind of complexity within the kind of character. I mean, he's an absolute shit, but at the same time, he can sometimes occasionally justify himself quite well. So yeah, I would say him. I think he's a really fascinating one.
And what about more broadly? Let's step outside of the Warhammer universe for a second. Has there been a favorite project that you've worked on?
I mean, I'd say it varies massively. I mean, one of my first games was playing an inventor in Tin Hearts, which is kind of this game where you kind of you play. It's basically problem solving a puzzle. It's kind of like Lemmings on acid. So it's like 3D Lemmings where you've got to get these tin soldiers from one side of a room to another side of the room. And each level is a different kind of like room. So you're having to kind of move bits of furniture around and all of that kind of thing. But the actual kind of like narrative around it is kind of like this riff on, the kind of like the genius creator who, because of some terrible personal kind of like tragedy, is driven to create bigger and better kind of like amazing kind of creations. And the actual narrative of the game goes in some really interesting kind of like ways. And so it was this, on the one hand, it was this incredibly complex, but really fun, really beautiful looking kind of like puzzle game. But then it's wrapped in quite a layered narrative. And so for me, that was a really fantastic thing because it kind of like it marries something very playable with the storytelling trope. Whereas in some games, it can feel a bit like you do a bit of the playing and then everything stops whilst we tell a story. And then you go back to the playing. So that felt a little bit more kind of like integrated. And that was probably my first kind of like lead game in a lead role in a game, and I really enjoyed that. And also it was with a small dev team who were just like really passionate, really determined to see it through. I think the game was almost cancelled about 3 different times, and I was recording bits of it from about 2016 through to when it released in last year in 2023. So seeing a project like that all the way through is really lovely. Whereas quite often for a lot of these games, you're literally brought in for the last month, and they get their voices, and then you say goodbye, and then that's it. So yeah, that was a nice one.
Fair enough. That sounds interesting. And I suppose finally, being a Warhammer podcast, it would be a shame not to talk about the tabletop game a little bit. In terms of hobby, do you still play, or any interest in starting?
I don't play, and I wish I had the room, but again, I'm like, justifying it, just justifying it. I'm debating the idea of like maybe starting an army and maybe doing a little bit of painting just for the meditative aspect of it. Very much so. That would be nice, but I don't have other people that I know of that I'd be able to kind of like play with right now. A lot of the people that I know are really getting back into Dungeons and Dragons and all of that kind of thing. So never say never, but at the moment it's not on the cards.
No. And I suppose if it was on the cards, what would you start with? 40K, Heresy, Age of Sigmar, or Old World?
I would say probably Heresy. Yeah.
Ooh. And
Yeah.
what Legion?
I would say Blood Angels.
Yes. Yes,
Yeah,
Chris.
would
Yes.
be
The best Legion.
yeah. I mean, but the Ultramarines were my first, but just because they were first doesn't mean that they were my best by any stretch of the
No.
imagination. So yeah.
Just because they're first doesn't mean they're best. Listen in, Dark Angels fans. Well, I say the best Legion. I'm in Heresy. I'm much more of an Alpha Legion fan, but in 40K,
Oh, really?
Blood Angels are my my thing. Like, I've got a huge Blood Angels project that's kind of waiting in the wings, no pun intended.
Well, that's lovely. I mean, the feel that you something that you literally have to invest in. I mean, that's the other thing is that we literally just don't have the space
Oh,
in our house to do it yet. So I need to. So that means that anything that I buy has to be in my studio, which means that I've therefore got to navigate around it whilst recording. So whilst it would be nice to have a whole legion in here with me, I don't know how much that would acoustically serve my further work. So there is that too.
True. And if I've read your website correct, you do have a cat as well. And cats are, I think, hobby pests.
Yeah. They are, yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I have recorded vast quantities of my voiceover work with my cat on my lap because she's quite quiet. But yeah, she's an integral part of some of my social media, aside from the 40K stuff. It's kind of like, I think they play to very different audiences, but I think both are equally as valid. But I can certainly see her being a bit of an issue in terms of like with the figures, for sure.
And now if Honey the cat had a voice, what accent do you think she'd have?
For no justification other than it would be a completely entertaining. She'd probably be more of the kind of like Eastern European, the terrible things that I will do to you. Maybe a kind of calm, the betrayer kind of thing going on.
Sort of sexy, sort of threatening.
Yeah, sort of sexy, sort of threatening. Definitely has a body count in the corner of her visor. For sure. So yeah.
Cool. Well, Chris, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for spending some of your valuable time with us.
Not at all. Absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for asking me, Dan. It's been lovely.
And any shout outs? Anything you want to add?
I mean, to you, obviously, thank you so much. The only other people that I would shout out are obviously the Black Library to check out all of their kind of stuff, particularly actually Richard Reed, who is a good friend of mine, voice acting friend of mine, but he was the first person that kind of said to me, "Oh, by the way, I do stuff for the Black Library. You should check out their stuff," because he's a phenomenal actor, done a lot of 40K stuff in terms of audiobooks and also games as well. Incredibly amazing performer as well. So if you're not familiar with Richard's work, then you should check him out.
And if people want to see some of your work, you're on Instagram. I think it's ChrisNaturallyRP. One word. And TikTok as well, right?
Yeah, that is true. Yeah, I am a 42-year-old whose main following is on TikTok, which is hilarious. I mean, until it's banned in the US, and then God knows what happens. But anyway, yeah, at the time, yes, ChrisNaturallyRP, those two, and then it's at CG Tester on X/Twitter/ whatever the hell it wants to call itself. But yeah. It's all there, people. It's all there.
Awesome. Well, as I say, Chris, thanks so much for joining us. So I suppose all that remains is for me to ask you, would you like to dismiss the podcast with our usual catchphrase?
Sure. Keep calm and crusade on.